Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Nearshore Restoration Summit and Synthesis, day 2 of our embayment session and the last day of our 6-day summit. If you've come to every single day, you're a rock star. And if you haven't been able to make it to all of them, no worries. We are recording this and we will make all of the presentations available after the summit. My name is 𝗃𝗺𝗃𝗀𝘁 and I'm the Science Manager for the Estuarine Salmon Restoration Program at the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I'm also the chair of the Puget Sound Ecosystem Monitoring Program's Nearshore Work Group. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered together but apart on Coast Salish ancestral homelands. I am speaking from Olympia, Washington, which occupies the traditional territories of the 𝗥𝗶𝗀𝘆, 𝗂𝘆 and 𝗂𝗺𝘆 peoples, whose ancestors resided here from time immemorial and who still thrive today. We respect and uphold the Coast Salish peoples and sovereign tribal nations as knowing bodies and defining partners in our effort to improve the integrity and resilience of ecosystem processes that support environmental and human health and well-being. As we gather in this virtual space, welcome everyone. I would like to orient everyone to our Zoom rules of the road for this summit. So first off, enjoy yourself, settle in. We've got a great lineup of speakers today. And if you can, give yourself permission to unplug a little bit from other things. Silence your phone if you can, turn off your email, really give yourself that space to take in this great material. If you're having a technical issue or if you have a question for a summit organizer, you can use the chat function of the Zoom. And panelists, you will have to use the chat function if you have a question for another speaker. And please write the name of the person to whom your question is addressed. Attendees, if you have a question for a speaker, please use the Q&A feature, and also please write the speaker's name to whom the question is addressed. Speakers, please feel free to answer in writing any questions that we don't have time to answer live. Our team will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat for the entire meeting, and we've built in some time for live Q&A after each talk. Speakers, please mute yourselves and have your video turned off when you're not speaking. And our moderator, which today will be Jason 𝗃𝗃, will unmute and say 2 minutes left in a kind but firm voice at 10 minutes into your talk. And at 12 minutes, he will unmute and turn his video on and play an alarm and really encourage you at that point to wrap it up so that we have time for questions and transition to the next speaker. We will have a break at the end of the day, so a time when everyone can get together and interact informally, which is another place to ask questions of the speakers if you wish, and I'll talk more about that right before we do it. It's called the Wonder Lounge. It's pretty fun. And so today and for this whole summit, we've invited a group of scientists and practitioners who represent an interdisciplinary set of perspectives. And our collective job is to create a space that is respectful and open. And we ask for your help in creating that space. We give a huge thanks to our steering committee. This amazing group of people has really helped us to define the questions for the summit and to create a vision for the structure and makeup of the summit that you see. We thank Ron Thom, Megan Detier, Jennifer Griffiths, Devin Smith, Chris Ellings, Simone DeRoche, Doris Small, Sydney Fishman, Don Pucci, and Paul Cheragino. Thank you all so much. And this is our planning team. And we are all here today thanks to the hard work of this group. And we are all here behind the scenes, making sure that everything runs really smoothly. So we've got Lindsay Desmel, Jenna Jewett, Darren Williams, Hannah Faulkner, myself, my cat's not with me today, David Trimbach, Jay Krenitz, and Jason 𝗃𝗃, who will be moderating the session today. So just to kind of orient you to where we've been so far with the summit, we had 2 days of beach presentations, 2 days of Delta presentations last week, and today we are on the final day of our summit, day 2 of embayment presentations, and we are just so So happy with how everything has been going and with the amazing speakers. So these speakers, we've had 78 individuals from over 50 organizations and entities that represent state, local, regional, federal, tribal, nonprofit, private, and academic organizations. And I just feel so humbled and inspired by the expertise, perspectives, and knowledge encompassed by these amazing speakers. And I encourage everyone to browse our program and read their full biographies. And so these speakers were individually invited to reflect contributions from natural scientists, from restoration planners and practitioners, and from social scientists, including experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion, to help us think about how we can better incorporate these principles into our restoration work. So how did we get here? The idea from the summit really started from conversations between the Puget Sound Partnership's 𝗶 Nearshore Work Group with me and Jason 𝗏𝗃, and the DFW's Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program with Jay Kreenitz. We started talking to David Trimbach and about how we could incorporate social scientists, and this idea has been incubating for at least a couple of years. And we thank everyone who encouraged us to sort of pursue this vision along the way, and also to 𝗶 for the funding to help make it happen. So what are our goals? With the help of our steering committee, we developed these sort of broad goals for the summit. First, to synthesize nearshore restoration science, to capture insights from restoration practice, identify the most important science and management questions to guide future actions. We wanted to update the 𝗃 conceptual models for restoration, and to think about how we can incorporate social science principles, including diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what we did was we asked each group of speakers a different set of questions to help guide their presentations. So for natural scientists, we asked, what are the key implications of your research for planning or implementing process-based restoration? For you, what are the most important uncertainties to address with future restoration that will result in future research that will result in more effective restoration? And then how does your work improve upon, add nuance to the 𝗃 conceptual models for restoration? For social scientists, we asked, what does your social science or field or area of expertise contribute or add value to planning or restoration? What are the major social science gaps and needs that you observe or experience within your field or area? And then what needs to be done in order for you and your research to be better integrated into practitioners or natural science researchers' work? And then to restoration practitioners and planners, we asked, what have you learned through your experience with project development, design, implementation that informs the needs of future restoration? We really wanted to capture that. And then for you, what are the most important scientific uncertainties, whether they're natural science or social science, that might be limiting planning, designing, implementing, or evaluating nearshore restoration? So what you see here is a blend of each of these groups of speakers, and this is our lineup for today. And you can see we've really tried to integrate across these disciplines to best create an environment where everyone is listening to each other and learning. And we hope that this is going to be a really good model for the proceedings that we will be creating from this. So what our goal is to bring together restoration practitioners and scientists to share what we've learned, the questions that we have, and to chart a course for the next generation of restoration and research through the creation of a proceedings following the summit. And then share the results of this, or share the proceedings with the entire broader Puget Sound restoration community and anyone whose work might be informed by this effort. So thank you all so much for being here, and welcome. And we are so excited to have you and for this wonderful group of embayment speakers. And with that, I will pass the mic to Paul Schlenger, our first speaker, and to Jason 𝗏𝗃, our moderator.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, and Paul, if you want to start sharing your screen and fire it up here.
I need access still, please.
You need access still. Do you not have a share screen button?
I cannot start sharing. There we go. Okay, hang on a sec. It's coming.
Isn't it fun being the first person of the day? You're doing great.
It's all smooth sailing.
All right, everyone. Paul Schlenger is with ESA, and I can introduce him as he's pulling up his talk. He'll be talking about restoration planning at coastal streams and embayments along the railroad. Thanks, Paul, for being our first speaker of the day, and take it away when you're ready.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you so much. I want to start just by thanking the whole summit team for bringing this together. This has been really great, and excited to be a part of it. Learned a lot from the talks, and hopefully have some good information to share today. So going to be talking about an ongoing project that we're very excited about, restoration planning along the railroad, focusing on restoration at coastal streams and embayments. And I am part of a great team on this. This is a grant that's the 𝗃𝗺𝗃𝗀𝘃𝗄 Tribes grant they got through US EPA. It's a Habitat Strategic Initiative funded grant. And so I'm working with 𝗃𝗺𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗃𝗄 on this. And in the past, kudos work with Andrea McLennan. She provided some great input to an earlier part of this. So as a prominent stressor on the shoreline, railroads cut across the mouths of coastal streams and embayments and have a lot of effects on our nearshore environment. And their importance of these systems is it's about the fish. And 𝗥𝗶𝗃𝗁 did an amazing job yesterday describing his and others' amazing research on juvenile Chinook use of the nearshore and small streams. And as he demonstrated, the embayments are preferentially used by fry outmigrants of juvenile Chinook. And recent work by him, 𝗃𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃 and others demonstrated that Chinook are also using the lower reaches of non-natal streams. So the streams that are cut off by the railroad and access limit the habitat for early outmigrant juvenile Chinook. Coastal streams and embayments are about the fish, but they're also about so much more. Sediment inputs, large wood, organic matter, prey, and good habitats upstream and cutting off estuaries. Just a lot of effects. And this image here shows how stream mouths and embayments. This is just south of Everett. This is showing stream deltas that are really providing the only complexity along this reach. So the railroad lines the entire shoreline there, cutting off all the sediment sources from feeder bluffs. But the sediment outputs from the streams have provided small deltas, and in this way you can kind of see they're the only complexity along the shoreline. This is a shot looking downstream at the lower end of a stream, so looking out the Puget Sound, which is behind the train in this picture. You can kind of get a sense of this larger stream getting kind of neck down into smaller culverts to go through. You can see there's two culverts at this site. There's wood stacked up there. This is some of the kind of disconnection that we're working to address. As I said, it's a prominent stressor along the eastern shore of Puget Sound. This map here shows the rail network in orange along the left-hand side. So there's 52 miles of shoreline with the railroad directly on the shoreline, and another 21 in which the railroad's within 200 feet. So substantial areas where the railroad's bisecting the lower ends of our coastal streams and embayments. So the work we're doing for planning for restoration, we're getting underway with the second phase of it. And in phase one, first we inventoried and prioritized streams and embayments. If you look on the DFW fish passage database, for example, you won't see all the tidal culverts along the railroad route. This was new information that we added. We just didn't have an inventory of them. And we went out and inventoried in the field and then prioritized them. And in phase two, which we're just at the outset of, we're advancing restoration planning. And a lot of my photos so far, and a lot of when I get rolling on this, I just talk about the coastal streams, but I'm also talking about the embayments, and those are shown in these two images here. One's on the left is a historic look at an embayment where the railroad just cut straight across what had been a more complex shoreline. And then at this time, this was, you can kind of see it's on a trestle bridge still. And then over time, the railroad filled in those embankments, and it's more cut off, such as what's shown on the right-hand side. So in the first phase, one of the key elements of it was an advisory group that we convened, and BNSF was a participant in that and a willing and frankly enthusiastic contributor right from day one, right from the start. They've been genuinely excited about this and available at every step of the way. So we started with a field inventory. This map shows 196 culverts in yellow, not continuous along the shoreline. That's because there's the railroad is not everywhere along the shoreline. These are the sections where the railroad is. 196 culverts, 13 embayments, which are in green. Hopefully you can see the color difference there. Of the culverts, about 125 we estimate are perennial streams. Another 20 that we were able to survey were stormwater drainage or more of intermittent streams. These are the ones we got to. We actually, in our inventory, identified 268. We weren't able to access all of them in the field. When we hit the field, data collection included collecting a suite of parameters in the downstream habitat, the upstream habitat, as well as the crossing characteristics of the culvert itself. And here's a few slides of kind of what we saw. So we saw some perched culverts. Here's a buried culvert, no flow coming out of this one. Actually, flow's been rerouted to another area. You can kind of see that the quarry spall from the embankment's kind of encroaching on it. There's also sand built up in the middle of it, a log across it. We saw some broken culverts. For BNSF, this isn't necessarily a structural problem. This is at the end of the pipe, which doesn't affect whether the train structural integrity is intact. And we saw some other ones like this nice channel across the intertidal. And not all of them were all that bad. Here's one where there's a wide trestle bridge across an embayment opening. Here's one where instead of a round pipe, there's a box culvert. Little out of focus here. Apologize on that. Zoomed in, but you can see this is a photo taken during following a storm, and you can see the stream kind of spilling in from left and right into the channel that it's allowed to go under the embankment. And here's another look at that same site on a sunnier, lower flow day. And this is what we're talking about and looking at in terms of a stream that's wider getting funneled down into a narrower culvert. This one's actually Meadowdale Beach County Park in Snohomish County, pretty close to being a success story. Final design for replacing this undersized culvert with a 5-span trestle over 100 foot long is in progress, is complete. The design's complete. It's going to be constructed starting this summer. And this is a look at just an example of some of the habitat upstream that if the culvert downstream is too small and fish can't get into these areas, they're not getting access to these habitats. Focusing mainly on Chinook, but other salmonids like coho, steelhead will use these systems also, and cutthroat. So the outcome of phase one, we did a prioritization. We based it on the likelihood of juvenile Chinook salmon using the area. That was based on Beamer's research in the Whidbey Basin. So we applied the information from Skagit, Stille, and Snohomish across the entire project area. And we identified 17 streams as the highest priority. So those are shown on the map as the blue largest circles here, distributed throughout the project area as it turned out. So that was phase one, and now this is what we're getting underway with now. And this is work in progress. So for phase two, we're really excited. We're working with BNSF, and we want to be working with local partners also on the preliminary design evaluations to get moving on 3 of the 17 high priority sites. So we want to be working towards a conceptual design and cost estimate, really getting real on restoring some of these sites. For all the others, we want to develop recommendations for what is approximately what the right restoration treatment might look like based on site characteristics, stream size, slope, and other considerations, just to add information about, basically call it the tools in the toolbox for restoration at these sites.
All you're at 2 minutes.
Great, thank you. And this is what really I'm excited about, initiating a regional dialogue. We're looking forward to reaching out to a number of you to talk about restoration at these sites. We're looking for local partners who want to do a restoration along the railroad. We want to help identify funding sources and alternative pathways for implementation. Maybe it's mitigation, restoration. And we want to, through working with BNSF and the local restoration practitioners, establish basically a unified process for engaging with BNSF, making sure folks have the right information at the time they reach out to BNSF. So we're gonna kick this off with a virtual meeting that we're planning for the week of April 19th to 23rd. We haven't settled on a date yet or a specific time. Please contact me if you're interested in getting involved in this conversation. My email's there. Hopefully I'm easily found by Google and findable to follow up with. And then last slide, I mentioned Meadowdale Beach County Park is happening soon. This is kind of the before after potential there. The existing condition at the top, the culvert, the box culvert is behind the tall tree on the right-hand side. And then the proposed, this is just a conceptual rendering, but trying to show what an opened up park with a more than an acre estuary upstream of the railroad, whereas now there's none, would look like. And don't worry, this is for artistic purposes. We'll have a full range of riparian vegetation as part of it too. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Paul. Great talk to start off our day. And we have some questions rolling in. Jenna?
Yeah, quite a few here. So Hugo asks, what are the parameters or criteria to prioritize use by fish? And is upland use considered?
Yeah, great question. So we looked at two main components in our prioritization. One was likelihood of fish use, which we based on the 𝗵𝗆𝗄𝗃 et al. 2013 study, juvenile Chinook use of non-natal streams. They identified a number of parameters, including proximity, watershed size, whether the existing culvert backwaters that we looked at. We do have a final report that'll fully explain the methods of that. That was one component. The other component was, okay, well, if you get the fish to these habitats, what are you delivering them to? And so a look upstream at the habitat that would be made accessible was part of it also. That was the second component.
Okay. We've got another question from Jenna. Is there any on-site public interpretation of the science behind the restoration and the cultural resources of the area planned?
I assume, is that for Meadowdale? Meadowdale, where we're actually making traction and there's going to be restoration on the ground. I mentioned Meadowdale, that's about to happen. And then Kristen Williamson's work with Titlow Lagoon will hopefully be happening soon. I expect there's going to be abundant educational outreach through signs, programs, and everything at sites like this. When you make such a large investment in restoration, it's very important to communicate communicate to the general public why we do these things, what are the benefits. So it's a big part of it. For the general work that we're doing so far, we have fact sheets that are available on the internet, but not at specific sites that don't have work ongoing.
Okay. Looks like we might have time for one or two more. Jason asks, are there any avenues to create functional pocket estuaries associated with the rail system?
That's what we're working towards. Yes. So yeah, this is a picture here, still showing my screen at Meadowdale County Park. This is one where upstream of that, we're creating a estuary behind that. And so yeah, we're looking to help reconnect and create pocket estuaries.
Okay. And we've got another question. Jason, do we have time for one more?
Yeah, let's do one more. And
Okay.
Colin, if you want to start sharing your screen while that's happening, that'd be great.
Okay, great. Teresa asks, in the name of cost effectiveness, are you seeing any opportunities to put a one-size-fits-all design at several locations to cut down on design costs? Or as I would expect, each site is unique and needs its own design process.
Yeah, great question. That is what we are trying to help identify kind of a one-size-fits-some approach as part of this second phase of work. That's part of the 4 restoration treatments that we're trying to develop. We need to make sure we're in alignment with Pad and Doris's work and DFW's fish passage guidance overall, to be smart about that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. And thanks everyone for asking questions. A reminder that the speakers can type in responses to ones we don't get to. So please keep sending those in. Next up, we have Colin Greer. Colin is at the Department of Anthropology at Washington State University, and we'll be talking about indigenous shoreline management in the Salish Sea, the view from archaeology. Your slide looks great. Colin, take it away.
All right, thanks, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, thanks first to all the organizers and presenters and attendees. I really appreciate the opportunity to contribute. I must admit my regular day job reality has kept me from attending as much as I had planned, but really enjoyed what I've been able to see. And the leaf blower guy is just showing up right now, as is always the case on Zoom. So I have 2 goals for my allocated 12 minutes today. First, to describe what we know from archaeology about indigenous peoples of the Salish, how indigenous peoples of the Salish Sea constructed and managed shorelines over the last 5,000 to 6,000 years, and probably earlier than that too. We just don't have much of an archaeological record prior to about 6,000 years ago. And second, consider how those practices might inform how we think about and approach restoring and managing shorelines today and into the future. Okay, so what you're looking at here is an archaeological site in the process of excavation. It sits right at the shoreline in an embayment on the north end of Galiano Island in the southern Gulf Islands of British Columbia, Canada. And the site consists of thick shell-bearing deposits, as you can see there, which many simply refer to as shell midden, which sort of implies that it's just a pile of refuse, but it's clearly much more than that. It's a large ridge that formed the back terrace of a long-standing cedar plank house village. It's a mounded place that was recognizable as a landscape marker from afar, from out in the Strait of Georgia, from 𝗂𝗆𝗆 Pass as you move through the pass between Galiano and Valdez Islands. And it's also a place where ancestors lived and continue to reside. So the deposition you see covers about the last 2,000 years, and that's really the lifespan of 2 major 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝑚 villages that existed in this location. So the excavation revealed it was built up in an iterative fashion, and by that I mean through repeated small additions of shell matrix and some larger transformative construction events. So it represents the long-term construction of place with investments physically, but also in the construction of ancestral ties and of enduring meaning. This really wasn't a research excavation, however. The locale was excavated with and in partnership with the Penelakut First Nation because it was being damaged and lost rapidly through coastal erosion. And there are many causes of this erosion. Of course, anthropogenic sea level rise is a big factor, more intense storms associated with climate change, a major increase in tanker traffic, in ferry traffic, and just generally in marine craft around the area, especially at really high tides and high storm tides. Also terrestrial land use. This is in a BC provincial park, and recreational foot traffic really takes its toll on shorelines as well. I think that's sometimes underestimated. And these together are a nasty cocktail, one that threatens to destroy the entire site, really, and indeed threatens much of the coastal archaeological record throughout the region in the near future, not just in the distant future. We're already seeing, as archaeologists, the dramatic effects. So After the excavation that you saw a couple slides ago, we, meaning the Pen⁡ First Nation, British Columbia Parks, and my team of archaeologists rebuilt the slope, attempting to stabilize it. We took a small scale approach, and it didn't last long. We were humbled after one winter. Of course, putting a few small posts and rocks really didn't solve the issue whatsoever in terms of protecting the archaeological shoreline. A few years later, we went a little bit bigger after losing more of the shoreline. And this larger protection wall, if we can call it that, it seems to be doing the job of protecting the ancestral site and stabilizing the shoreline, at least for now. So far from a perfect solution, but of course, cultural values were paramount in this situation. And it was an effort to pursue a more softish kind of approach and produce a semi-permeable armoring that utilized actually existing beach logs in the front. This area is, just because of wave action, accumulates a lot of escape-age log boom logs and things like that that end up on the shoreline, and those were able to be mobilized for this. Yeah, and so a soft approach, and almost every well-intentioned third party suggested that the solution was to, of course, pour riprap over it or build some kind of cement seawall, but that wasn't the objective at all here, since it was entirely inconsistent with cultural and, of course, ecological values. But importantly, the project was community-based. That is, the Penelakut community took the lead. And the actual construction was very much akin to traditional plank house architecture, at least in the standing post component. So I suppose it could be considered sort of semi-traditional or perhaps neo-traditional in construction, and we could use that term. But the effort can be seen as another iteration of constructing coastlines and a continuation of longstanding practices of managing coastlines and generating connections to place. And is far from a permanent solution, of course, but that's the point. The process is iterative, and it continues to be iterative. We'll likely be doing this again in 3 or 5 or 10 years and assess what works best then, and certainly many parameters of the situation will be different by then. So that's really the key. It's iterative, additive, and adaptive. And plus it foregrounds a bottom-up approach, a community scale solution involving partnerships and collaborations with Indigenous communities in the lead. So looking to the south end of Galiano Island, here at Montague Harbor, there's a remarkable and long-term and indeed much more expansive record of shoreline construction and management. The primary process here involved using shell-bearing matrix as construction material. Many constructed features have been documented at Montague Harbor, long shell-midden ridges that acted essentially as water control dikes, constructed wetland gardens in behind those dikes, fish trap systems, terraforming for village siting. So really the archaeological view here is 2 villages, one at each side, these large up to 4 meter in depth and 300 or 400 meter long shell ridges that actually form barriers to seawater inundation, at least in this particular embayment. Here we have an open situation where the shell midden extends to partway across this embayment, leaving an opening, and there's an intertidal fish trap at the outlet. So a lot of investment in landscape construction here and coastline management that produced a series of microenvironments that promoted diversity and sustainability in this location. And this location is a keystone cultural place, a longstanding village site and loci of habitation over almost 4,000 years. So this is cut through one of these shell dikes that had been built up over 4,000 years, according to radiocarbon results. So we had an opportunity here to see the internal structure of one of these and the kind of temporality, if you will, of how they were built up, its internal structure and whatnot. This was a culvert upgrade, actually. So a previously disturbed area since the early historic period, that a culvert to allow seawater access and outflow was being upgraded. So we got a good view of what was going on inside one of these constructions, all the way down to, as you can see in the lower right there, down to really essentially glacial clays. And then a peat layer that's pre-archaeological, probably a natural peat layer, and then an initial shellman layer 3,800 years ago. So really complex things that were built over a long period of time. And we've looked at Montague Harbor pretty intensively, but this pattern is repeated over much of the southern Gulf Islands. See coastal spit sites, as I refer to them. Here I've highlighted a few of them. These are all cultural keystone places, again, long-standing village locations. Here's Dionysial Point on the upper right, where we were just at the start of this talk. So this has been going on at an impressive scale, this shoreline alteration, enhancement, and management system, and has been going on for a long time. So very much have to think of these coastal places as anthropogenic and managed. And indeed, shorelines all throughout here can be considered very anthropogenically influenced and managed over thousands of years. People are aware of this, I think, now through clam gardens and the idea, or sea gardens as the terminology is shifting to, just the alteration of the foreshore and the effects of that in terms of resource productivity and whatnot. But clam gardens are really simply a part of this larger shoreline investment and management strategy. So it's becoming on our radar through the archaeological documentation of it, and it's getting well known in this area where I've been working on this for 10, 15 years, less well known certainly in Puget Sound. So key message, of course, is that many of these shorelines are anthropogenic and have been managed for millennia. And I see it akin in some ways to the anthropogenic management of forests through burning. The situation is very similar in that these aren't natural places, just like forests aren't pristine natural wilderness in a lot of ways. And I think it's important to recognize too that shorelines with archaeological sites, and that's a fairly significant amount of the Salish Sea, are taking it hard these days, in part because indigenous communities are no longer able to actively maintain and manage these places.
Colin, you're just under 2 minutes.
Perfect, just hitting the wrap-up slide. Okay, so what's the lessons here? How do we bring all this forward? Of course, the goals embedded in past indigenous management practices are the same that we all share now: fostering resilient, sustainable, and productive shorelines. And indigenous practices clearly worked well on those terms and were successful over much of the Holocene, resilient to sea level and ecosystem change, and an approach that accommodated resource intensification and the demands of high density populations. So these past strategies and practices act as a kind of mirror for what we're doing now. And on this slide, I've arranged what I see as two poles of approaches and practices. So indigenous values and approaches skew far left on this, involving what I construe as a managerial approach that involved persistent engagement with places over long periods of time. And we could perhaps contrast that with what I might call an interventionist approach on the right, where there's more singular interventions in coastlines to shape them and hopefully set them on their way in a more productive path. Our current approaches, thinking of restoration and whatnot, probably are a complex mix of all kinds of elements on both sides here. But the key question is, how do we skew things a little more to the left? And of course, that isn't about going back to the past somehow. We're clearly in a different historical moment with the circumstances we're dealing with, from which we must go forward. So how can we rejig our approach and practices more towards what has worked for millennia? That's really the key question, both in what we do and how we communicate about what we're trying to do. And perhaps the past offers some important guidance on that. And just to sneak in a final point here, and this is referencing Jennifer Arnold and 𝗷𝗃𝗀𝑉ilson's very insightful presentation yesterday afternoon, a key first step would be to meaningfully partner with indigenous communities in thinking about ways to approach shoreline restoration and management efforts, so as to draw on multiple ways of knowing and doing in a way that honors rather than appropriates deep time vetted knowledge and practices. Because shoreline management is a physical process, but it's also a social process. Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Colin. That was a really informative talk. And yes, a good link to the talk yesterday too with Jennifer and 𝗷𝗃𝗀𝗀. That's a good link to make. Jenna, how are we with questions?
I'm not seeing any questions quite yet. Oh, I see one actually from Tish. I'd love your perspective on the translation of these ideas in a landscape that has so much more degradation as we observe in Puget Sound.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about just the railroad talk prior, and just how, you know, there's a single railroad cutting that coastline or bordering that coastline. Yeah, that's interesting. You know, how does this actually get mobilized as an on-the-ground practice? I guess that's sort of the question for everyone. I mean, in some ways, the coastlines of British Columbia are equally as impacted, certainly along the Metro Vancouver area. And you know, along UBC, the University of British Columbia, there's a lot of talk about how to restore the coastline in an urban setting here, rather than, say, somewhere out in the Gulf Islands where I work. So I don't know. I mean, that's sort of a question for the restoration community and to really throw around. I wish I had a good focused answer for that. Of course, there's just so many constraints on what we can and can't do these days.
Thank you. Are we ready for the next one?
Yes, we should move on, but people still, you can type in a question for Colin, and Colin would have a chance to answer via typing. So thanks again so much, Colin. Great talk. And Hans, if you want to start sharing your screen, that would be great. Hans Davenberger is with the 𝗃𝗏𝗆𝗆𝗆 tribe, and we'll be talking today about mapping nearshore juvenile salmon habitat in North Hood Canal and Admiralty Inlet. Your slide looks great, Hans. Take it away.
All right, thanks. Thanks everybody for having us today. This has been a really outstanding opportunity. Our project, what I'm going to cover today, basically takes place from 2011 to 2014. And the 𝗃𝗏𝗆𝗆𝗆 tribe wanted to better understand how juvenile salmon outmigrate through Hood Canal and Admiralty Inlet. And we focused mostly on northern, mid to northern Hood Canal and Admiralty Inlet. And I wanted to point this out right now at the beginning of this talk, that our work doesn't really focus on summer chum outmigration. It occurs earlier in the year than when we sampled. And it also misses some of the techniques we use, missed some of the intertidal embayments, like the northern half of 𝗂𝗆𝘀𝘁 Bay, which is up in this area, and 𝗃𝗺𝗶𝗴𝘁 Bay. And I think those are important things to point out. So we used many different methods to do this, and our capture-based methods, we used surface trawling, beach seining, and zooplankton sampling. And then we used passive methods. So we used Biosonics DTX system, which is basically a very fancy scientific fish finder, but it allowed us to identify individual fish or individual targets that we allowed us to estimate densities of single targets along the shoreline. And we also used EXO2. It's a sonde, a multi-parameter sonde, to measure water quality along the shoreline. So we measured pH, dissolved oxygen, salinity, conductivity, and chlorophyll temperature. And this is what some of the data looked like for us. And it's kind of interesting, particularly for chum. So these would be fall chum primarily. But we saw them in our beach seines earlier in the year, and then they kind of moved offshore into the surface trawls, but we're still in Hood Canal. And that was a little surprising to us, because most of the past research from the Hood Canal region kind of indicated this fairly rapid outmigration of chum salmon. And most of that research was driven by beach seine. So I guess what we saw that was unique here is that the fish weren't leaving the system entirely. They were just moving into slightly deeper water as the months moved on. Chinook are a little different. They're a little larger fish, and they tended to be present in both our beach seine and surface trawls kind of throughout the season. Coho were similar. And pink in Hood Canal, they were only present in the beach seine. So they were really near shore oriented during the Hood Canal portion of their outmigration. Once they reached Admiralty Inlet, most of the Chinook, coho, and chum, you can see just kind of an extension of their presence in those areas. But with pink salmon, we did start to see them in the surface trawl data. And this is a couple of examples of our acoustic data. So we have here our heat maps of fish density along the shoreline. And I wanted to show this to point out a couple of things. There, we saw a lot of variability from year to year and month to month. And it was clear that fish movement was very dynamic within the Hood Canal and Admiralty Inlet regions. And so we looked at this and we thought, well, is there something that we can look at to kind of help explain it? And so we started looking through and comparing that to our water quality data. So this is an example of June 2013, the fish data on the left and the temperature data on the right. And you can begin to see certain trends. So we've already reached almost 19 degrees Celsius in the mid-Hood Canal region. This is kind of the surface layer, the top meter of the water column. And corresponding with that is relatively low density of fish. And you can see they're starting to move out into some of these places, moving away from that potentially stressful temperature regime. Something else to point out here is that in the southern part of 𝗂𝘃 Harbor, that there are a lot of fish in that area. You can see some fairly extreme temperatures in that area already in June. And then again, this is looking at salinity. So again, you can see much fresher water on that surface layer, and that's indicating some really strong stratification. So the surface layer is clearly being separated from the deeper marine layers in Hood Canal. Hood Canal is a fjord, and it can get up to 600 feet deep. And so there's this very strong stratification that's being driven by temperature and salinity in this region. And we expect that probably affects productivity. And one other thing to point out that we noticed during this process, there's something very dramatic happening in this area, and later on we'll talk about that, but that's kind of around where the Hood Canal Bridge is. So this is chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is kind of that primary productivity driver indicator. And again, you can see very, very low chlorophyll data here in the mid-Hood Canal region. So that strong stratification is clearly I'm assuming this was post spring bloom, once the nutrients were used up in that top upper layer of the water column. The productivity kind of became absent from that area. So what I really want to point out there is that with looking at the acoustic data through heat maps, it was very clear that we weren't going to be able to identify specific shoreline features like types of beaches or spits or some aspect like that we could directly associate with fish density. And so we decided that we would have to take a little bit broader approach because the fish were just moving around too quickly. They were too dynamic to look at these kind of smaller scale features. And so what we did is we broke the shoreline up into subregions and used a factor plot analysis to give us the ability to kind of compare one region with another. And what jumps out at you right away when you do this is that these large embayment systems consistently had higher densities of fish use. And so we wondered, can we explain that? Is there a reason for that within our data that we can kind of help explain that? So we went back and looked at our biological samples. So we had gut content data for chum, Chinook, and pink salmon. And, they're feeding primarily on crab zoea and insects and larval fish. Those are kind of the big components there. There's some euphausids in the pink diet. And so we looked at our plankton data, and this is just an example from 2013. But if you look down here at the ducklebush, which is down in this region, again, this was highly stratified, low productivity during this time of year. There's almost nothing in the water for fish to eat. As you get into 𝗂𝘃 Harbor throughout the summer, you can see there's a lot more food there. again in Port Gamble Bay. And then Thorndike Bay was sampled this year in 2013, and that's in this area. And again, if you look back at that water quality data, this is where you'd start to see some mixing occurring and a lot more primary productivity in that chlorophyll data. And then we had beach seine data, which included larval fish in it. And we looked through our larval fish data set, and 𝗂𝗄𝘁 Harbor, Port Gamble Bay again, and Port Ludlow Bay all had relatively high abundance of larval fish present during this outmigration period. Whereas, basically all of our other subregions, they're virtually absent from. And I do want to point out that Quilcene Bay is a really productive herring spawning area, but because our sampling effort was really focused on Chinook, fall chum, and pink salmon, by that point, those larval fish are fairly absent from that area. Port Gamble Bay, Port Ludlow, and 𝗂𝗄𝘁 Harbor are really productive spawning habitats for sand lance and surf smelt. And this data is probably driven primarily by surf smelt, larval surf smelt. We really wanted to provide clear recommendations the big take homes from this project for us were that these large embayments were playing an outsized role in terms of fish use, and that fish were very dynamic within Hood Canal. They were moving quickly to follow foraging, take foraging opportunities. So they're moving rapidly with food. They were quite dynamic in their distribution, but the embayments, these large embayments, were kind of playing an outside role and were a consistent place where fish were going.
And so, under 10 minutes.
Thank you. And so we wanted to be able to provide very clear recommendations to our policy and restoration practitioners. And we used lots of different data from other resources, but primarily we relied on this particular report that was developed by Point No Point Treaty Council in 2006. They looked at the old T-sheets and compared to those to current day data sets. And that allowed us to provide our policy people and restoration people with very specific ranked projects for those large embayments and around that transitional, the Hood Canal Bridge basically is the other thing. And this is just an example of one of those projects. So the 𝗂𝗁 Harbor connection that was really been pushed forward by the North Atlantic Salmon Coalition, but would probably not have happened without the tribe's policy people bringing the Navy on board. They, through mitigation, through adding this to a mitigation measure, elevated the project to a project of national security significance. And that's what allowed it to actually move forward. So one other thing that we did there, once we started to realize that these embayments were going to be important, we helped to add the culverts under the 𝗂𝗁 Harbor project to the state's culvert list, and then we've been monitoring that project pre and post project. So you can see here water quality conditions that have changed just immediately post. I'm going to quickly run through. There's just one last thing. The Hood Canal Bridge, you can't talk about salmon restoration within the Hood Canal region without talking about the Hood Canal Bridge. It came up during we noticed it during our water quality monitoring. We've been now part of the ecosystem impact assessment team. And the big takeaways from this are that we tagged wild steelhead, and we saw a 50% mortality rate at the Hood Canal Bridge of our tagged steelhead. That's absolutely huge. And that it's also affecting Chinook and chum salmon at pretty significant. Well, just to give you a sense, the two pictures in this picture, that's the kind of densities of chum and Chinook salmon that we're seeing at the bridge. I think I'm pretty much out of time. So if there's questions, if anybody has a a phone, they can look at these little QR codes.
Yeah, thanks for including those. Those are great to include. So thanks for the talk, Hans. And maybe we can do one quick question. And Mendy, if you want to start sharing your screen, please, while that's happening.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, so Nissa asks, currently with permitting in-water construction, the in-water work window to avoid salmonids is July 16th through February 15th. Based on your presence abundance data, do you believe this should be changed for Hood Canal?
I think maybe, yes. I guess yes is the answer. It probably, that's a complicated question. But, you know, there are fish in Hood Canal for quite a bit longer than we had anticipated.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for your talk, Hans. And any more questions, please type them in for speakers to type in a response. But let's move on to our next talk, who is Mendy Harlow with the Hood Canal Salmon Enhancement Group. Mendy will be talking about how can we show we are making a difference. Your slide looks great, Mendy, take it away.
Thank you. And I wanted to also say thank you to Tish and Jay for the invitation to present today. It's definitely a great opportunity to connect with others. I'm going to talk today about how, as restoration practitioners, we often don't know if we are making a difference. So one goal that I have for this presentation is to hopefully develop some interest in partnerships that can help us learn more and show the improvements that we are making to habitat. I'm definitely smart enough to know that we need to be collecting information, but not necessarily enough to know what exactly it is that needs to be collected. So for those of you who don't know the Hood Canal Salmon Enhancement Group, we're one of 14 regional fisheries enhancement groups throughout the state of Washington. And we work throughout the Hood Canal watershed with partners such as state, tribal, and federal agencies, as well as community groups and classrooms. We focus on habitat restoration, environmental education, and ecosystem research. So the restoration work that we do ranges from small riparian enhancement projects to larger fish passage correction projects, like this one on Seabeck Creek, and then even larger, more complex and more expensive estuary restoration projects, such as this one on the Union River that we completed along with the Department of Fish and Wildlife in 2013. So when Tish asked that I contribute to the summit, my initial thoughts were, oh my gosh, what do I have to contribute? I'm not really a scientist, but when I got to thinking about what uncertainties exist in our work and what I've learned through my experiences and in project development and design and implementation, I realized that we rarely know that we're making a difference unless we're able to afford a significant monitoring effort before and after our restoration projects. So my main take-home message is that because large-scale estuary restoration projects are so expensive, they need pre- and post-project monitoring so that we can show the impacts of the work that we're doing. So we can basically convince funding sources that the work we're doing is effective, so we can continue our restoration efforts throughout the canal. So such as, vegetation, monitoring the vegetation changes, because a lot of times we are changing the environment from a freshwater or upland area to be a more salty or brackish area when we do estuary restoration, so that plant community is going to change. And then monitoring the location of sediment, because we see that the tides and currents are changing the landscape. Use by wildlife too, not just use of birds, waterfowl, but also mammals. So this picture was taken in the 𝗥𝗶𝗆𝘁𝗄 estuary and is an elk herd that regularly commutes into the estuary to feed upon a lot of the salt-rich nutrients in the estuary. And then we also like to monitor water quality related to shellfish habitat and figure out if we're changing the salinity and making areas more hospitable for shellfish or the opposite. And then, of course, monitoring juvenile and adult fish populations. So unfortunately, we have access to very little funding to complete this pre and post project monitoring. Here's just one example. In Hood Canal, $6 million is allotted to habitat restoration each biennium by Surfboard, and only $50,000 to monitoring projects. However, it's not just the Salmon Recovery Funding Board's responsibility to fund all of these monitoring efforts. So one tool that we use as regional fisheries enhancement groups is enlisting community volunteers to do the work for us. So in the case of the Union River estuary restoration, we've been lucky to have a 20-year-long community effort to monitor the summer chum population there. The adult population has been monitored since 1999 with a temporary weir trap that is operated by volunteers annually from August 15th through October 15th. People of all ages contribute to this monitoring effort, and it has become a major event that the community looks forward to every year. The trap is located right along the main highway that heads into 𝗏𝗡𝗆. And volunteers also get to educate the community about why we're monitoring summer chum and their importance to the Hood Canal ecosystem. You know, a big question that folks have when they stop by the trap is, why aren't we monitoring coho or chinook? Because they are fish that folks like to catch and eat. So we get to tell them all the benefits of chum and why we're monitoring their populations instead. So in addition to the intensive monitoring at the Union River was also the broodstock donor for the reintroduction of summer chum to the 𝗃𝗺𝗃 River from 2003 through 2014. So we also have many years of DNA, otolith, and population data from the Union River to help us show the success of our estuary restoration project there. What we found was that the first 3 brood year returns following the estuary restoration were the highest non-supplemented returns since 1975. And in 2018, we also added a rotary screw trap to start collecting outmigration data. This was initially only funded through the Department of Fish and Wildlife's 𝗟𝗃 Volunteer Cooperative Grant Program. However, we were also able to secure Salmon Recovery Funding Board monitoring funds later in 2018, which is currently sustaining that juvenile monitoring effort. So what we have found in the analysis of the juvenile data compared to the adult data is that while our estuary restoration was effective, there's very low juvenile productivity in the freshwater, and that we need to complete more habitat work in areas where summer chum spawn to increase the egg in gravel survival. So the red line on the graph there is adult returns, and then the blue is the juvenile survival. So pretty low survival rate for juveniles, but we are seeing increases in the number of adults returning. So our organization typically has over 10,000 volunteer hours logged each year. Volunteer-driven work definitely has its pros and cons, and use of volunteers sometimes limits the type of equipment that can be used and the type of monitoring effort that we are taking on. So for example, reading a YSI meter is definitely a volunteer-friendly activity. However, using a CTD or side scan sonar equipment might not be so volunteer friendly and requires some technical expertise. Additionally, some data collection needs to be completed by the same person every time. So the reason I'm bringing up these points is that we are taking on a couple of really large estuary restoration projects over the next couple of years, including our partnership with the Department of Fish and Wildlife in the restoration of the 𝗥𝗶𝗆 estuary. So Lisa Bellevue from the 𝗂𝗏𝗃 tribe has offered to help develop protocols for sediment, vegetation, and water quality monitoring there. So I'm really happy about that partnership that we're developing with the 𝗂𝗏𝗃 tribe in this project. And we're also working on restoration of the 𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗆 River estuary along with Jefferson County, and are looking to do a lot of shellfish monitoring in the bay there over the next couple of years. So we see these both as great opportunities to learn about how these restoration projects are benefiting the local ecosystems and seeking partners to help us with pre and post project monitoring. Maybe there are folks out there with grad students who would be interested in this as a type of research project, or have an interest in partnering, have extra funds, or are already doing monitoring activity in the area, and we just need to connect and don't know that. So I've got my email address up so we can connect in the future, and I will take any questions.
Great. Thanks so much for your talk, Mandy. Jenna, how are we on questions?
I'm not seeing any yet. Feel free to put them in the Q&A, folks.
I'll ask a question while we're waiting for people to type in. When you're working with all those volunteers and other community groups, Mandy, how do you see, like, when you see people come back, do you see them like moving up and taking more of a leadership role, or is there kind of like a constant engagement and training to go along with that?
Yeah, a lot of our projects are annual projects. So a lot of those folks do take leadership roles as they return each year. We also have a research internship program as well. So we have college students that come and volunteer for a semester or a quarter, and they gain college credit for that time with us. They also get to take on a leadership role and get to lead other volunteers in the efforts as well. So it's definitely a very nice to see returning volunteers each year, because there is less training that needs to be done with them.
I'm still not seeing anything in the Q&A or the chat. Sometimes they just trickle in.
While we're waiting to see if there's any more trickling in, I will just say a quick thank you again to all the speakers this morning. We're coming up on our break here now as well, which may be why there's a little bit of radio silence. So if you do have a question for Mandy, please type it in, and we could either ask it live now, which looks like there's one maybe, Jenna, coming in now.
Okay, I think it's a comment from George, but I'm happy to read it. So excellent talk, key points and approach. The combination and integration of volunteers and higher level scientific methods is so needed.
Yeah, we're really, we really like to get the community engaged in our projects. It definitely helps them kind of take ownership of something and get involved and, you know, learn more about Hood Canal and why we need to protect it, for sure.
All right, we've got one from Krista. Ooh, and a couple more coming in. What are your thoughts on the value of monitoring for site-specific assessments versus developing more of a regional picture? Where might standard metrics be helpful or not?
Yeah, so our group has, I mean, I guess every estuary restoration project is different. There's different levels of restoration that occur at each location. So in our estuary restoration at the Union River, we basically were able to breach a levee in 2 different locations to help restore the estuary there, but weren't able to remove the entire levee because it serves as a walking path for folks in the community at the 𝗱𝗺 wetlands. So that's very different than like what we're undertaking with the Department of Fish and Wildlife with the removal of the Highway 101 causeway, because we are hoping to do a complete estuary restoration there. So I think that, you know, site-specific protocols are pretty important when we're talking about, you know, different restoration scopes like that. However, you know, I do believe that, you know, collecting specific types of data doesn't necessarily change from location to location.
We've got 1 minute and another question. So Hugo asks, are you doing habitat assessment using the TFW methodology on the different streams?
Yes, we are. So we have summer interns that come and work with us every summer and do TFW surveys on different rivers and streams throughout Hood Canal. They kind of do a cycle throughout the Hood Canal and, you know, return to rivers after 10 years or so, so that we can also see that change over time.
Awesome. Thanks, Mandy.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks again to all the speakers this morning and for everyone for being engaged and asking questions. We are on break now. We'll be back at 10:50 for 𝗵𝗵𝗴𝘆𝗆. All right, hello everyone. Welcome back from break. We have 4 more talks here before lunch. And I'll introduce our first speaker after break, 𝗵𝗵𝗴𝘆 with the Northwest Watershed Institute. We'll be talking about 3 crazy concepts for nearshore restoration in the 21st century. So when you're ready, take it away, Peter.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everybody. The applause is deafening, but I will proceed anyway. I wanted to give this talk because I've been doing habitat restoration now for various places for 30 years, and I've seen how concepts change and paradigms shift. And I thought I'd be fun to talk about 3 mini paradigm shifts that may or may not happen. But they're kind of interesting ideas. Nearshore restoration is such a young field that in 20 years, we can all expect that the earth we think is flat now will be round, and other paradigm shifts will occur. So my first paradigm shift idea was brought about, triggered by a study we did that's on our website. And it had to do with a springtime congregation of bald eagles on 𝗏𝗏 Bay. Up to 150 eagles gather on a little stretch of beach. And we didn't really know why. And this is the first documented study in United States on these springtime eagle congregations. And we had some theories that had to do with turning over rocks. And you can see the plain fin midshipman down in the corner there, and its eggs are on the undersurface of the rock. And they come in every spring and lay their eggs. They need a particular type of beach. They need flat surfaces to lay their eggs on the underside of. So rocks work really well. Here's one here. Also, what I call old growth oyster beds that have pretty big clusters of oysters. And here you can see the bald eagle coming in and feeding on these. And there's a couple areas of Hood Canal where this occurs. They also occur under logs. And so with soft sediment, they'll dig their nest underneath these logs. And even under boards. So lift up a board and you can see the eggs on the undersurface there and the garter male midshipman below. So it started me thinking about how there's so little wood on the beaches of most of our bays of Puget Sound, and that historically it may not have been that way. And we put so much emphasis on stream restoration of now putting wood back in streams, and even in the marine environment, artificial reefs. And there is wood that falls on the shorelines. Most of it's cleared out fairly quickly. This is a shellfish beach where this wood was cleaned up fairly quickly so you could drive on the beach to deal with the shellfish. There is some wood, but it seems like it's a real area for opportunity for research. And we built an artificial wood structure as part of a larger bulkhead removal project. This is right out on the tidelands. And I would love to do more of this and monitor it. But the first moral of this story is, where's the money? Where's the money for monitoring to monitor something like this? You know, if you got a fringe idea, it doesn't get funded. So I'd like to recommend that we fund a few fringe ideas once in a while to learn something totally unexpected or maybe out of the ordinary. Second kind of paradigm shift idea that I was thinking about has to do with nearshore summer chum use of Hood Canal. This is a map from Wild Fish Conservancy that shows the dark green as the natal rivers for summer chum. And our strategy here in Hood Canal has been to fund nearshore projects that are right near the mouths of these natal rivers. And because that's considered the most important place for juvenile summer chum. So if you're looking to do a nearshore project in Hood Canal, you really can't get funding for, of course, my pet project up here in 𝗍𝗏 Bay, or really any other nearshore area that's not within a mile of the mouth of a major river that supports summer chum. So in 2004, we did a study to see what was up in 𝗃𝗏 Bay, and we had 21 sampling sites and all around the bay, fairly intensive. Actually, 2003, the study was done. And what we found was pretty kind of surprising. Summer chum were distributed all along the shorelines of 𝗍𝗏 Bay. The closest natal stream is the 𝗂𝗶𝗆 River. So fish had to go a couple miles to get out here. And so I was kind of surprised by that. So I asked Cy Simonstad about it. And I said that, you know, the assumption is that these summer chum are vulnerable for a few hours or weeks they spend in the natal estuary before they roam. So this is their most important habitat. Is this a valid assumption given they may spend much more time in higher quality non-natal rearing areas, such as a salt marsh of 𝗃𝗏 more than 2 miles from their natal streams? He responded back in 2004, no, there is no reason to suggest that early entry chum fry are more or less vulnerable within the natal estuary. They can migrate up to 14 kilometers a day. So why is one nearshore location more or less important? There's no question that the natal estuary should be tier 1. There's also no question that non-natal estuaries may play fundamentally the same role. That was back in 2004. Since then, there's been some other major studies done that you probably hear about today. One was the one by the Port Gamble tribe. And they're basically, one of the conclusions of that study was prioritizing actions in productive bays with abundant zooplankton and other prey communities, rather than focusing solely on proximity to natal streams. Another study, 2018, summer chum use of nearshore habitat all throughout. You can see the sampling stations here at the mouths of natal estuaries, as well as, you know, 𝗍𝗏 Bay and other places along the shoreline. And just have a short, back when it was 2018, I asked Micah about this and he responded that the results are pretty exciting. We're seeing that non-natal embayments are absolute hotspots for summer chum, which are using those habitats more than natal deltas. So this has big implications for funding, of course, millions of dollars put into nearshore restoration. And are we putting it maybe not in the wrong spots, but are we missing spots where we should be putting some funding that are not natal estuaries? And the data seems to be, and the information that's accumulating seems to show that we have a little paradigm shift that needs to happen here. And I'm hoping it will. It's been 16 years since we did the initial study, and studies since then have just strengthened that kind of conclusion that we need to reevaluate that. The third paradigm shift has to do with how we approach nearshore restoration. For example, this nice little salt marsh or protection for that matter. Here is 𝗃𝗏 Bay, and here are these salt marshes. In the 1980s, DNR decided they wanted to protect these salt marshes. So they bought this little piece here and they bought some of this, and you can see it really hasn't changed since 1883 to 2000. It's the same, fairly intact, really high quality, rare plant communities, etc. But how do you really protect a salt marsh like that? All the sand that builds these and maintains these comes from miles away through coastal longshore drift. So we really had to start looking at protecting the larger nearshore. too many landslides might be bad. And here's one related to a house construction and drainage. Too few, too little contribution might be a problem. So we looked at where the overall landslide risks were for deep-seated failure, shallow rapid landslides, deep-seated. And we came to the conclusion that we really needed to protect the whole estuary if we were going to protect these high-quality salt marsh habitats. We're going to have to look at the uplands surrounding the estuary as well. And this couple 100-acre protected area has grown to about 10,000 acres. It now includes also one of the really pristine estuaries of Hood Canal, which is Thorndike Bay over here, which is a 2016 addition. Nevertheless, when we go for funding, it's very difficult to, the kind of quandary is, on a big project, not all of your parcels are going to be high priority. So if you're trying to protect a large area and you've got a little piece over here that you need to buy, it's going to rank so low on anybody's priority list that it's not going to get funded. Yet it's somewhat essential for the overall project. So how much weight do we put on landscape scale project versus site-specific nearshore restoration? How much weight is given to whether it's a standalone project or whether it's part of a larger effort? So I think this needs probably some more consideration as well.
Peter, you're just under 2 minutes.
Okay, so that's pretty well where I'm at. Here's some of the pieces that all the green are parcels that have been purchased, probably over, at this point, over 75 separate land acquisitions by, 30 different project partners to build up this 𝗍𝗏 Bay natural area. And not all of these are high priorities on their own, but together they're really critical for building the larger piece. And we're actually now looking to go beyond that to protecting globally imperiled forests next to the estuary, which of course is important for bald eagles, great blue herring rookeries, and other species that depend on the estuary and are part of that larger ecosystem. So that's it.
Great. Thanks so much, Peter. That was a really interesting talk.
Yeah, thanks.
Jenna, do we have any questions rolling in?
We don't have any questions yet. No. I would just say that was an excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you.
That means I get to ask one of my, fill the radio silence questions, which the interaction of bald eagles and plain-footed midshipmen in 𝗍𝗏 Bay is fascinating. You mentioned that congregation of bald eagles has happened a few other places. Is it for the same reason?
Yes. Probably the largest congregation is on the other side of Hood Canal. And every place you find these, you find those big cobble rocks, basically. Jackson Cove is the best place in Hood Canal, really, where you've got just the beaches for geologic reasons is all cobble. So you've got tons of eagles, over 100 eagles that come in regularly there in the springtime.
So Jessica asks, have you developed a prioritization tool similar to the Stille tribe or Raya 6 to show importance of different lands to acquire?
Yeah, I assume that means within the 𝗍𝗏 Bay natural area with all the parcels we have out there. Actually, it's a good question. We're in the process of doing that now, and it should be available. And we're doing that with DNR and the Jefferson Land Trust, but it basically looks at every parcel for its biological and landowner interest and a whole bunch of other criteria. And that's going to come together as kind of a big GIS exercise in June.
Okay. And one more from Jim. First comment I think we need to state is great holistic long-term work. Are there more armor removal or large wood placement projects you are trying to implement in this area?
NWI owns about a half mile of tidelands in 𝗍𝗏 Bay. And I would love to do a wood placement project there combined with the monitoring to see what's happening. And I think that'd be a really cool project. There are a few, one of the largest bulkheads in Hood Canal is located in 𝗍𝗏 Bay. And unfortunately, that wasn't funded a couple years ago. We have new landowners there now. I don't think that's going to happen for a while. But we have a few of that. Most of them have been removed, though.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Thank you. Oh, by the way, I just want to mention most of the reports I mentioned are on the website if people are more interested in the Eagle study or the nearshore stuff. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks so much, Peter.
You bet.
And let's move on to Brian Katz. Brian, if you want to start sharing your screen, please. Brian is with Oregon State University and will be talking today about access to recreational shellfish and its implications for environmental justice in the Puget Sound. Your slide looks great, Brian. Take it away when you're ready.
Great, thanks Jason, and thanks to the Summit team for the invitation. Really happy to be here participating in this conference. So yeah, as Jason mentioned, the title of my talk is with respect to recreational shellfish and access to it and its implications for environmental justice in the Puget Sound. I want to thank my colleagues too, Whitney Fleming, 𝗂𝗶𝗶𝗴𝘁, and my advisor, 𝗵𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. I'm currently a research assistant at Oregon State University, but a recent graduate of the geography program. So why this work matters? Well, shellfish are really important to the people of the Salish Sea, especially with respect to the treaty rights of the sovereign indigenous tribes, both with the Bolt decision in 1974, but also the later Rafiti decision has guaranteed half of the marine resources and shellfish to the sovereign tribes. So when we're talking about access to shellfish with respect to local foods, this is especially important to upholding treaty rights for the sovereign tribes. And of course, if you've grown up in Washington State, you may have gone shellfish harvesting before. It's a really important activity. And shellfish harvest closures, or what we're talking about today, they become a problem to access to shellfish harvest, safe access, implications to human health, of course, if there are biotoxin or pollution issues. So yeah, this is the basis for why we're talking about the project I'm about to present. So the research questions that are guiding this work across Puget Sound watershed subbasins, what are the relationships between how often people harvest and the duration of closures, and the reported race of people who took a survey, the vital signs survey administered by the Puget Sound Partnership, and closures. And then finally, what's the relationship between race, particularly non-white population, and harvest frequency. So the methods that were used for this project, I developed a geovisualization tool that shows the public data from Washington State Department of Health on shellfish harvest closures. And then, like I mentioned, the vital signs survey data that's administered every 2 years by Oregon State University and Puget Sound Partnership. And this survey has details on how often people harvested shellfish in the past year, and demographic detail of race too. And so we use this geovisualization tool to sort of identify some places and times of interest, but ultimately we analyzed the places, spatial units, to test for correlations between the 3 factors. So one quick note about the survey data, it's based on a random sample of people who completed that 2020 vital signs survey. That is sent out to random addresses around the Puget Sound. So it's, you know, the data that we're using, it's low tribal representation for harvest frequency. So it's really important to keep in mind for this work that most of the responses that came back from the survey were white, which does reflect the overall demographics of the Puget Sound area. But with respect to the non-white population impact on here, that is important to note that, you know, our findings are only as good as the data that we've got, and there weren't as many tribal responses. And then one other note here, because the survey asks about many factors related to human well-being, one of which is access to local foods. There were a lot of questions on the survey about different species people harvested. This project I'm presenting on is looking just at bivalve shellfish harvest. So that's clams, oysters, mussels, geoducks, but not razor clams. So these are the types of shellfish we're talking about here. So this geovisualization tool that I created, I'm going to jump into it to show you all. I'll post the link in the chat so you can explore this on your own time. But this is showing a time series of shellfish harvest closures from 2017 to 2020. And you can use this panel on the left side of the map like a controller to filter out what is shown on the map. So if you're wanting to see a time series visualization, you can drag a window of time and select that on the map. What's also being shown here is a few charts describing what types of closures are selected, if you want to see recreational versus commercial closures, and then how many closures there were per county is shown here too. But I'm going to turn off the time series layer for a second because in the following slides, I'm going to be detailing the analysis that we performed using the survey data and the closure duration. So that's these three layers that you can turn on. This is the frequency of harvest, which is red, the non-white population, which is blue on the map. And you can see when two layers are turned on the map, you can see some places where those colors combine to make like the purple spots on the map where there's non-white populations who harvest frequently. And then you can turn on the recreational closure duration layer. And this is just a summary of the days closed in 2020 for recreational shellfish harvest. So I'm going to jump back over to the presentation here to discuss the analysis. And although the map and the screenshots I'm going to show have county boundaries, the analysis that I'm going to be showing are really for these 7 watershed subbasins that have recreational shellfish beaches. So the survey responses we're looking at are also contained within these watershed subbasin boundaries. So the key takeaways, I ran a k-means clustering analysis for the 3 factors we were looking at. To see how those watershed subbasins match up with one another. And overall, there were 4 unique kind of stories that emerge. There's places where closures were high, harvest frequency was low, and non-white population was high, compared to other places where closures were low, harvest frequency was high, and there's a good amount of non-white population too. So you might look at these 2 groups and think of, you know, the distribution of impacts from an equity lens, like these are the losers and these are the winners, kind of an idea. And then there's a unique story in Puget Sound. This is a really big watershed subbasin that encompasses all the way from Whidbey Island to the South Sound. And as you can see in the screenshot here, there's quite a few high duration closures that are just present throughout the entire year related to pollution along the I-5 corridor. But in the North and South Sound, there's very few closures, so that's what kind of drives this closure duration finding for Puget Sound so low. And then there's the case where there's few closures, few harvest frequency, few non-white population that responded to the survey. So that was the overall picture, but I'm going to take you through each of the 2 relationships, like 2 at a time. So if we're looking at just the duration of closures and harvest frequency, that's what you see here. We found an indirect relationship between biotoxin closures and total closure duration and how often people harvest. So it was significant too. So, you know, the more biotoxin closures there are, that's really driving down. It's correlated, not caused, right? But it's correlated with a lower harvest frequency in the populations that live in those places. For the race and closures question, we found a direct relationship depending on the closure type. So for pollution, conditional, and emergency closures, we found a direct relationship with the non-white population. And there's perhaps some environmental justice implications with that in terms of targeting restoration efforts in a means to increase access to local foods in communities that are non-white, that also harvest frequently. So places where you see the sort of blue and orange on the map might be areas to look at. And then for the relationship between harvest frequency and race, we didn't find any relationship, which is also interesting considering that may indicate that harvests of shellfish are important to many races. And what's interesting about this clustering result is maybe this is the effect of the pandemic in 2020, lowering the amount of times people are actually going out of their home to harvest, because it looked like in most places around the Puget Sound, people harvested sort of infrequently, but Hood Canal stands out as a big outlier where the residents who live in the Hood Canal area harvested shellfish very frequently compared to the others. So overall, how are these relationships explained? You know, if you're looking at each one by one, the indirect relationship between closures and harvest frequency, that's like saying closures decrease harvest opportunities. When it comes to race and closure duration, it depends on that closure type. So for pollution, conditional and emergency closures, there was that direct relationship between the non-white population and the duration of closures. So that could have the environmental justice implications. And then with harvest frequency and race, there was no relationship, meaning harvest might be very important to all races.
Hey, Brian, you're just under 2 minutes.
Perfect, thank you. These are some other considerations that were not within the scope of this study. Things like what species did people actually go and harvest for? There's some beaches where clam season's closed, but oyster season's open, and we don't know from the survey what other divisions of species people harvested within that overall sort of bivalve category. We also don't know where people harvested, which is really important to consider in interpreting these results. Because the survey can tell you where people live, and you can make some assumptions that people who live close by to those shellfish beds have easier access versus others may have to drive a really far distance to get to open areas. So that has some equity implications too that just weren't looked at here. And then how the concentration of biotoxins varies in space and time. That's of importance as well in terms of inequitable impacts potentially. So what can be done? I would say work with the local communities on the ground. The map that I developed is open source. It's online. Anyone can access it with the link. So maybe there's more opportunity here for community engagement. And I think that this problem addresses sort of a win-win-win scenario where you can address ecological and environmental restoration issues while also targeting environmental justice and increasing access to local foods. And with that, I will take any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for your talk, Brian.
I'm not seeing any questions here. I think first off, is that a dog in the background?
Yes, you can hear that. That's my dog snoring. He's a Boston Terrier.
Very cute.
That, yes.
Very cute, very soothing. There is one here. I'm just going to read through it quickly. Colin asks, wondering if you think it's important to understand the degree to which shellfish contributes to household economies as important variables in assessing impacts of closures on equity. Frequency of harvesting sort of gets at that, and race is probably a poor proxy for that, but assume that there's quite a bit of variation in the goals of harvesting that might be useful to assess. What are your thoughts?
Right, that's a really great question. Obviously the commercial and economic values for shellfish is really high in the Salish Sea area. This study, because we're working with the vital signs survey data, was targeted just at the recreational harvest level. So the question was asking how often you hunted, gathered, or foraged shellfish as local foods. So it's not, there was a separate question related to if people are working outdoors, if they're actually maybe involved in the industry for shellfish, that's a separate question, but we're just talking about how often people harvest it for food.
Thank you.
Let's see, next up, Alicia, do you want to start sharing your screen, please? I'm not seeing, up here it comes, great. So Alicia Olivas is with the Hood Canal Coordinating Council. And We'll wait until you pull up your first slide there.
There you go. Are you seeing it? Okay,
I am.
great.
It's looking really great. And I'll just read your title here, The Duty and Burdens of Supporting Impactful Restoration. So take it away.
Thank you. So I'm Alicia Olivas, and I would like to talk to you about the support of restoration work in the perspective of from working from a salmon recovery organization. And I'm referring to restoration work in terms of both development of projects and implementation, in particularly related to salmon recovery efforts. I was asked what I've learned through my experience with project development, design, and implementation. What I learned is when there's multiple priorities, everything's a priority. What's wrong with that? Well, it's hard to garner support for projects and bigger actions when everything's a priority. So this little guy is a summer chum. He emerged from the gravel and headed downstream about 2 weeks ago in Salmon Creek, which flows into Discovery Bay in the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca. So I work for the Salmon Recovery Organization for Hood Canal Summer Chum. The region works at all levels of government, with all levels of government, NGOs, and the community at large to develop, adopt, and manage implementation of the Hood Canal and eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca Summer Chum Salmon Recovery Plan. I also serve as the lead entity coordinator, so I facilitate the grant round for the Salmon Recovery Funding Board for our region, which means I work with partners and support a specific projects to recover summer chum and Chinook salmon, as well as at the regional level in support of implementation of summer chum priorities. So I'm going to focus on summer chum in particular for this talk. The Hood Canal Summer Chum Evolutionary Significant Unit, or ESU, includes a large area and multiple watersheds. So all of Hood Canal all the way up to the Dungeness. We recognize that a balance of issues is needed, but without a clear plan of the multiple facets can easily detract from achieving our goals. The strategy in the Summer Chum Recovery Plan is to focus on extant subpopulations and strategically reintroduce subpopulations we had lost. This drove priorities for habitat needs as well, particularly near the natal estuaries. And we continue to maintain the importance of habitat near these natal estuaries in the nearshore. What I have observed is salmon recovery habitat restoration has evolved. We have completed a lot of great work. This is a barge just down the coast from the 𝗂𝗎𝘆 estuary. We were able to acquire the property. Hood Canal Salmon Enhancement Group led this effort. Acquisition reduced the complexity of landowner willingness to remove the barge. You can see that the old barge, I think that's a 1978 photo. Acquisition allowed for more extensive work, which was needed as there are a lot of surprises below the surface on this project. The project was able to adaptively manage the plan when surprises were made known. This is the 𝗥𝗶𝗆𝗁 Bridge of 101 in the estuary of the 𝗥𝗶𝗆𝗁. Some of the most impactful projects are very complex, and they are becoming more and more feasible. We are able to take on projects that are much more encompassing of the natural processes we are trying to restore. So this is on the main stem of the 𝗥𝗶𝗆𝗁. Here is a blind channel in the estuary that is cut off. But it takes kind of that big picture look of here's that blind channel and the big picture look of what is really needed to restore natural processes. And so this project is under design, and it's going to be a bridge to allow natural processes through all that, taking out that causeway. We're taking on restoration actions that are more appropriate to scale to meet our goals. Sometimes this is done as a large project. Many times it's in multiple phases and built over time. Both approaches take a lot of time. This particular project has a lot of complexities. We have a state highway and the infrastructure. It's emergency access for the community. There's a development upstream, often gets flooded out. And then we have very important shellfish beds here in the estuary. All these complexities have to be worked out at the project level, and it takes a strong stance on the priorities to ensure the resulting project is impactful for salmon recovery efforts. The process scale restoration projects have multiple stakeholders as well as multiple benefits. There's no denying it takes a huge level of effort and time to get a process scale project developed and off the ground, but it is often the nexus with salmon recovery priorities that drives large impactful projects to become feasible. Here's 𝗂𝗄𝑚 Harbor. Once feasible, and feasible in the sense of being able to develop a design, have stakeholders on board, there is a need to continue to support the project through implementation. Our project proponents are often NGOs, fish enhancement groups, conservation districts, land trusts, and the likes. We are asking a lot of these organizations to develop and move forward projects as they have evolved to this large scale actions, and they are increasingly complex. We rely on these groups to build stakeholder support, to work through thorny issues, and to keep these projects moving forward. How can we better support these efforts? We need to address some issues such as funding, the appropriate timescale to utilize funding. So this is a DOT road. DOT operates off a different project implementation timeline. All of our projects are often funded with the capital budget and limited in the time for that biennium or 2 biennium. These projects require longer timelines to address designs that are more complex, as well as coordination of strategic partnerships and strategic funding sources. Then we need to continue to support all these aspects as they move through permitting processes as well. There's a lot of balls to keep up in the air. How do we help keep these balls up in the air? At the very least, we need to be able to say it is an important project, along with it is important to many stakeholders. Landowner willingness and negotiations happen on the ground with the project proponents. Oftentimes, what makes a salmon restoration project feasible is that something went wrong for the landowner, flooding, erosion, something like that. Other projects that are more difficult to make feasible are in the areas where the impacts of humans have been successfully minimized. And as we're all aware, that is usually at the expense of natural processes. So how do we create opportunities when there isn't something going wrong in the community? We need to invest in feasibility at the larger picture priorities. You have seen many examples of in the summit of assessments that have been done and lots of data that's been collected. That data is important for communication and education purposes to garner support for protection and restoration actions to happen. I find what is also needed is leadership. We need leaders to take a stance on priorities. That stance supports practitioners who implement restoration priorities. Encourage and support leadership to take a stance on priorities. Regional salmon recovery organizations need to have clear priorities too, to guide impactful recovery efforts. Priorities allow support at large scale or reach scale actions at multiple stages of implementation. This can happen at a smaller scale as watershed partners work in a bit by bit approach to achieve a larger action, but they need the support and guidance to get those difficult pieces, sometimes holdout landowners, in place to make it all work in concert. Without the stance on priorities, we are limited to opportunistic circumstances and are limited in scope to the funding source. We are not necessarily seeing the complete picture. Regional salmon recovery organizations need to have clear priorities to guide impactful restoration efforts. Even looking at the watersheds we focus on for the summer chum ESU, there's a lot of area and multiple actions to work on. We ask ourselves, what is most needed? What is the biggest lift for salmon recovery? What is the most urgent? What is broken and what needs to be fixed? We ask these questions at the ESU scale, the population scale, and the watershed scale. So I'm showing in this map, there's the Hood Canal population here. And up top, we have the Eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca population that make up our ESU. And we have priority areas that we have identified for abundance. So we have our core populations that are in the blue. And so we have specific watersheds that we focus on to make sure that we bolster that habitat to ensure that we have robust abundance into the future.
Alicia, you're just under 2 minutes.
Thank you. We also consider spatial diversity. So among the two populations where we feel we need to focus is down here where there's the brown watersheds. So we have the Union, Big Beef, 𝗂𝗆, and 𝗃𝗏𝗏. So focusing on these specific things, we were able to come up with a targeted approach. So this was a couple years ago. We were able to identify specific goals that were more targeted and we can highlight. And we were able to move this work along because we highlighted that. So this was presented to the Salmon Recovery Funding Board. We were able to get extra funding for the 𝗥𝗶𝗆 project. We're able to move discussions in the Snow Creek area. We have some acquisition funding going towards Big Beef, and we're developing these designs and working with sponsors on that. So we're able to move it forward, but they're all at different phases. So one thing that's going on is in Snow Creek, there was issue with the estuary. And so we're able to identify, you know, this is a priority for us because of that spatial diversity and that abundance. What's going on in the estuary? Well, we can look a little bit bigger picture and see the stream has some pretty big impacts. It was put up against the road. It's been straightened. It's higher in elevation where it would normally reconnect with Salmon Creek. So this is a 2-year flood and it's trying to reconnect. So pushing those discussions, we're able to work with people and identify these projects. If we don't set priorities, others will. We need to make stances and so we don't have to follow other people's stances, but the big action I have for you is to encourage various levels of leadership to voice priorities. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for your talk, Alicia. And Jenna, looks like we have a question.
We do, from Jason. Jason says, performance monitoring after project implementation is key to refine and enhance future project designs. Can you comment on how to keep this effort from being lost in the flurry of getting projects on the ground or in the ground when funding sources have a timeline and a functional lift does not necessarily fit those timelines?
Yeah, so I think, looking at the project level implementation is important to better our projects, and we need to keep doing that so we can have that better lift. But we also need to realize that there is some of that data, some of that information will help inform that bigger picture as well. So we need to keep that in mind and keep asking those questions at the ESU and population level as well.
Thank you. That's the only question I see up there right now.
Great. Well, thanks so much again for your talk, Alicia. And if more questions roll in, you'll be able to respond via typing in. And Micah, if you want to start sharing your screen, that would be great.
Okay, can everyone hear me now?
I can hear you, and I'm seeing, there's your PowerPoint starting to come up. Looks great. So Micah Waite with the Wild Fish Conservancy, talking about Hood Canal Summer Run Chum and Nearshore Fish Use Assessment. Take it away.
Okay, thanks everybody. I want to start off by thanking the conference organizers and everyone who put in so much effort making this virtual conference work. Really appreciate everything you guys did and the opportunity to share and learn. Also, it was great to be going last because a lot of folks have already helped set the table for what I'm going to discuss today. I think both Peter and Alicia gave great primers for what we'll be discussing. So I want to start off by acknowledging my co-authors. The work could have never happened without them. They did a lot of the data analysis and collection as well. That's James Fletcher, Aaron Jorgensen, Adrian Tui. We're all heavily involved with this project. And then our funders, we were funded by the Surf Board, the Salmon Recovery Funding Board, as well as the US Navy. So I'm going to start off by giving you guys a little bit of the punchline of our project. And we're here in the embayment session today. And that sort of punchline is that embayments are important rearing habitat for juvenile hood canal summer chum. We saw very high use of these habitats by the species, and we believe that restoration and conservation of embayment habitats throughout Hood Canal should be a high priority for Hood Canal summer chum recovery. Let's see. Okay, not sure why that one screen was blank, but taking a step back, kind of looking at a little bit more of a landscape scale, we're looking south-southwest. Those are the Olympic Mountains. These are some of the rivers that drain into Hood Canal. And I just want to give you a feel for kind of the landscape position of some of these locations. This is Broad Spit in a red circle. This is an embayment habitat in Puget Sound. Zooming in a little bit more, you can see the yellow arrows are pointing to how fish would migrate along the near shore as they come out of rivers and encounter an embayment habitat like Broad Spit. Here, kind of giving you guys a little bit of the scale, you can see to the south, we have a small boat there. I do believe this location was the picture for Peter's slide, where you saw the humpback whale breaching out of the water. I want to put in a little bit of a plug for this spot because it is absolutely my favorite place in Puget Sound. And if you have a chance to go visit it, it's like stepping back in time. And here we are actually at the site scale. These are our researchers collecting data, the biologists, and this is what our project was made up of. We did a lot of beach sands throughout the project. So Alicia covered this a little bit, but kind of taking a step back, talking about the natural history of Hood Canal summer chum. They are an endangered species. They were listed in the late 90s, kind of early 2000s. It was a couple-year process. The ESU extends from the Dungeness River to the Union River, so it encompasses all of the Hood Canal as well as some of Admiralty Inlet and the Straits. They really are kind of a rain shadow fish. If you think about the rain shadow of the Olympics, that is primarily where these fish occur. And they are summer chum because they enter the rivers in the summer. We start seeing entry in late July. It picks up in August and peaks in September, which is when spawning also peaks. And this early entry into the river corresponds to an early entry into the nearshore. So we're actually doing our nearshore sampling starting in December, running through February. And one of the things to note about that is that these fish are entering the marine nearshore prior to the spring plankton blooms that kind of drive the food web ecology a lot of folks are familiar with in Puget Sound. So what does that mean? We get to do some sampling during the coldest months of the year. A lot of times you picture a summer chum and you think of something warm, but our reality was we were out there during the coldest months of the winter. And this is adopted from the report that Hans had mentioned, and I believe Alicia as well, looking at the historic tidal wetlands throughout the ESU, throughout the Hood Canal summer chum range. And you see that only 22% of those historic wetlands are functional. Fully 17% are either filled or gone, and then over 60% are degraded or impacted. So there is a lot of meat on the bone for restoration, if you will. So we're all pretty familiar with the role of estuarine habitats, and I won't dive into it. I think this picture is interesting to me. This was taken out in the salt in a nearshore habitat. This is a juvenile summer chum, and we would often see this in late December, early January, where the fish are out in these marine nearshore waters. They haven't even buttoned up. They've still got their yolk sacs out there. And they really are more planktonic at this point in time than conducting volitional movement. So our study area in 2016, it was a broad study area. We had 50 sampling sites, and you can see using the scale, we're looking at You know, there's miles and miles and miles of habitat we had to cover. So this actually took 2 crews to cover, because we were sampling each of these sites weekly. And again, we sampled from late December through May. I won't spend too much time on this. We originally broke the project into habitat zones, and we had roughly equal time, excuse me, we had equal number of habitat types, so bluff-back beaches, embayments, river deltas, et cetera, within each of these habitat zones. And we really were trying to look across the full landscape here. But it turned out that at that grain, at that scale, we didn't see a lot of difference. But what did pop out, kind of jumping into our results, is at the regional scale, when we separated it into Hood Canal versus Admiralty Inlets and the Straits, we did see a pretty significant difference. And there were a lot more fish in the Hood Canal region than there were in the Admiralty and Straits, which isn't surprising given that the spawning populations for these 2 areas, there are just significantly more spawners in the Hood Canal rivers, and there are more rivers in the Hood Canal with populations than there are in Admiralty Inlet and the Straits. Jumping further into our results, what you're seeing here, there's going to be a couple of things going on with this slide. The first is all the dots are locations where we sampled and we recovered fish that had a genetic signature from 𝗲𝘗𝘀. So that's this basin down here, kind of on the south end of the Hood Canal. And you can see that we recovered fish broadly. We recovered a number of fish at distant sites, not necessarily as many at near sites, at sites nearer to the habitat. And we also had a lot of recoveries at sites that were away from the ocean. And sort of one of the null hypotheses that we were testing in this was that is the migration out pretty much linear? And do we have a migration that sort of looks like this animation that I'm going to put in? So here's a little guy, and the null hypothesis is his migration out looks something like this. As straight as can be, out into the Straits of Juan de Fuca, and then done. Here is, this is another set of data. We're kind of looking at the same thing here. Each of the orange dots represents a recovery of a fish that had the genetic signature of the 𝗂𝘆 system. And so you can see we had a number of sites, again, that were not on the way out to the ocean where we recovered fish from these locations. And that there was also kind of a broad distribution of sites within the nearshore where we recovered them. We didn't see a lot of sites where we're recovering 𝗂𝘆 fish right next to 𝗂𝘆, but not further away. And so we've got another little animation with a juvenile chum, and this maybe represents a little bit more of the what we think is happening, that you know, not all fish migrate linear. They are ducking into these other habitats before they move out, indicating, you know, fish are more likely radiating out from a natal estuary prior to some later drive that is sending their migration out to the ocean. So we talked about how 2018 was a little bit different, and this is related to the captures in Admiralty Inlet and the Straits. Because we had fewer fish in these areas, I won't go into the math, but our models didn't work as well if they were populated with a number of zero-catch data sets. So in 2018, we adjusted the study design and focused pretty much on the mid-Hood Canal 𝗍𝗏 Bay region. This was an area where we thought we would have a lot of high density of fish, fewer zero data sets, and that we could put together better habitat models with a more data-rich data set. And that was the case. It turns out we were able to build pretty nice, clean habitat use models on the 2018 data. You can see here, we separated the project area into 3 stratified sites within the overall area. Number of sites that we hit. Again, we tried to have equal number of habitat types within each of these subregions. And the punchline from that, again, is that we really didn't see a significant impact on river deltas for abundance with summer chum. And this was pretty surprising. That kind of goes against what we would expect to see in a number of locations. And I'll mention it goes against what we saw with the fall chum. These sampling efforts started in the winter with the summer chum, but we actually ran them all the way through the fall chum outmigration. And so we have these models built for fall chum as well. And we didn't see this same relationship where we were seeing lower use of natal delta estuaries versus embayment habitat. And this is kind of looking at that data a little bit more closely. You can see river delta fans significantly lower than both barrier lagoons and barrier estuaries for habitats.
Micah, you're just under 2 minutes.
Okay, great. That's perfect, because I just want to use this slide to kind of talk about the questions that were brought up, kind of the key points. Again, we really feel that embayments are important rearing habitats for juvenile hood canal summer chum. We see very high use of these habitats. And restoration and conservation of these habitats throughout hood canal should be a high priority for hood canal summer chum recovery. And going back to that question of sort of what are the key implications for implementing restoration from our work? And I think it's when you're thinking about landscape scale projects and trying to understand the grain of landscape scales, I kind of go back to those 2 slides, and I'll jump here. Looking at these various grains, at one point we thought this might be a meaningful grain to say, okay, this level of landscape connectivity probably plays a role in the abundance of fish we're seeing. But it turned out the grain was actually much broader than that. And as Peter mentioned, what we're seeing in current planning, and this isn't just Hood Canal, I've seen this in a number of watersheds that prioritize nearshore restoration, is there's some sort of distance from natal deltas that is a higher score for a project and some sort of distance that isn't. And we often see that the grain size of those distances in the planning processes don't match up to the grain size of the biological reality on the ground. And so I just think it's important as ecologists and as landscape ecologists, which is my profession, that we try to communicate the importance of spatial scale and grain size. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike.
Last slide, just because it's a nice picture. Oh, jumped out.
Now you have to give it all over again.
Here we go.
Ah.
Happy to take any questions now.
Okay, it looks like we are getting some in. Lisa says, in reference to the box plots, do you think that the Hood Canal Bridge may have impacted outmigration and might have been a reason why there were more fish in the canal rather than the straits?
You know, that's a really good question. And our study wasn't set up at all to really examine that. But based upon Hans's work and just the observations I've made on the Hood Canal Bridge, I do think that the Hood Canal Bridge is a pretty large impediment to migration, and that fish stack up on the downstream side of the bridge. You can see it if you're ever on the bridge when it's opened in the spring. Pop over and look, and it's like looking at a tropical reef. There's so many fish down there. I don't necessarily think that the large discrepancy we saw was 100% driven by that. And again, I think some of this is going to go to source populations. There are just a number more source populations in the Hood Canal than there are in the Straits and Admiralty Inlet.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions.
And I guess I will add that Hans's work showed that those fish are probably there in Admiralty Inlet, but they've moved offshore. And so what I think is probably happening is, in addition to the bridge maybe being an impediment to migration, is by the time fish are hitting those sites, they've grown a little bit more and they're in more offshore sites. So we're probably not picking them up as much in our beach seine sets.
Okay, thanks. What do you think, Jason? Do we need to move to closing remarks or take another question?
Well, Mike is the last speaker, so which means you won't have as much chance, if any, to type in responses. Do we have any more rolling in?
I'm thinking these are actually just comments. So that might have been the last one. Yep.
Okay, We're going to keep ramping here for a little while with closing remarks. So if you do have another question for Micah, please type it in. And thanks again, Micah, for a great talk and for wrapping it up that you are our final speaker of the whole Nearshore Summit. So a big thank you again to everyone, to Micah and everyone, all the speakers and all the attendees throughout all of this. And it looks like Tish, I think, will have some comments and bring up the Wonder Lounge.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I just want to say, wow, wonderful job, speakers, today and every other day of the summit. We are just so pleased and inspired by how high quality and just fantastic these presentations have been. Thank you all so much, and thank you attendees. Oh my goodness, you have no idea what to expect when one goes about organizing something virtual like this, and so we're just really excited to see that participation has been so high consistently every single one of the 6 days of the summit. So thank you all so much. And I guess I'll also just nod. How about our planning committee? How about you guys put your videos on and say hello, as we are all have all been working really hard behind the scenes to help all of this to happen. So just thanks, everyone. And the fun isn't over. So and I'm talking about today and also sort of as we move to the next phase of this effort. So for today, the next thing we're going to do is open up what we call the Wonder Lounge, which is an experience that will allow attendees and speakers to interact in a way that's totally informal, not orchestrated or facilitated or recorded in any way by our summit organizing team, a way to really help people. Oh, sorry. Okay. I just looked at my awkward. I just looked at my phone. Thank goodness for the group text. Is that better? No. Okay. Stop share. Okay. Anyway, Wonder is awesome, and we will post the link to it in the chat. And here, I think I'm just resting on my laurels too much, as we have almost put a punctuation on the presenting part of the summit. So so the way it works is you click on the link in the chat, and you'll go to this app, and it'll take a picture of you, and that will become your avatar. And you can move your avatar close to someone else's avatar, and it will open up a spontaneous video chat between you and that person. So that will, and then you can also move your avatar away and be in a different conversation, and other people can join your conversation, and it can become sort of a multi-way conversation. So it's fun. You can go get some lunch, come back and join it. And we are, some of you will be sticking around and reconvening at 1 o'clock for a smaller discussion. So don't forget about that. But otherwise, thank you all so much. And hopefully we'll see you over in the Wonder Lounge.